Hello and welcome to NARC Live on Wednesday the 17th of February, coming to you live from Norfolk on the east coast of England with Tammy M0TC.
Hello.
And myself, David G7URP. Good to see you all. On tonight's show, we meet the man behind the Sherwood equipment ratings. How does he do it? We look at some of your animals in these snow pictures, and we find out who works from a shack like this. Had several people guess. If you haven't entered yet and you want to, you can just drop something on Facebook or on BATC and we'll read them out when we get to that part of the programme. But first, some club news for you. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is direct to full license. Now, depending on your call sign and how long you've had your license, you may have gone straight to one license, like I have, a G7 or a G0 or something like that. But then there was the novice license before the full, and now, of course, the system is 3 licenses: foundation, intermediate, and advanced. And you have to take one after another before getting the full license. However, the RSGB are now consulting all members and all radio amateurs to see what you think about the idea of them going what they call direct to full. In other words, you can take one big exam that covers all of them and go straight from nothing to a full license. What do you think about that? Obviously, as part of the training team, I and lots of colleagues who are part of the Norfolk Amateur Radio Club training team, we've got our own feelings about it. This was only announced a few days ago as a possibility. But what do you think? Most of you watching, I know, will have a license of some kind. You may have found it a bit frustrating that you had to go through all 3 levels. Excuse me, if you already know quite a lot about the technology and things that you need to know to do the advanced. Then again, you may feel that it's more important to do it step by step. And would it put people off if they tried to go for the full license, failed and thought, oh, this isn't for me? Lots of things to consider, and the RSGB want to hear from you and from anybody who's got an opinion about it. Also, we'd like to hear from you as well. So this is where you can go to have a look at the consultation document. I must stress again, this is just a consultation. It's not definitely going to happen. The RSGB are now consulting radio amateurs and members of the RSGB to see what you think. You can go to this link, rsgb.org/direct to full. And you can make your feelings known to them, or you can share it with us at the club, and we'll read some of those out in a few weeks' time. And also, I think the training team of Norfolk Amateur Radio Club would like to also have its own say, as it were. And we'd like to do that based on all of your feelings about it. So what do you think? Is this a good idea? It's an option, by the way. It wouldn't certainly replace the 3-level approach that you do at the moment, the foundation, intermediate and advanced. It just gives somebody the possibility to go from nothing to the full license. So they'd be very interested to know, excuse me, and we would really be interested to know as well what you think. Now, James G7PQF sent a text a little while ago to me and to Tammy to tell us about something that's happening tomorrow. You may already have seen it on the news, I guess they're talking about it, but it's NASA's Perseverance Mars rover, and it's due to touch down on the Red Planet at 8:55 p.m. That's UK time, GMT, tomorrow night. But there's a whole run-up of programmes available. I think, Tammy, we've got a slide of it, haven't we? Actually, we've got a slide of also somebody who's James's follows to talk about that. Here we are. This is a gentleman called Mark Rober. He's got over 16 million subscribers. And it's someone who James sent us a link to. So if you want to know a little bit more about it and you don't want to look at the official NASA site, this is one to look for. Mars rover landing crash course. I hope it isn't a crash course. 1 day left. So this is apparently what's remarkable about this is it's the most precise landing they've ever had to do on Mars. So it's going to be interesting if you're interested in space. Or you can have a look at this, which is the NASA official page, which is mars.nasa.gov. That's the official countdown timer. As you can see, it's in 1 day, 1 hour and 19 minutes, which we reckon takes it to about 5 to 9 tomorrow night. So I know it's not strictly speaking radio, but many people who are interested in radio are interested in space and technology, and this will certainly be one to watch tomorrow.
I think the actual, if you look on YouTube, you can find NASA live on YouTube, and I think the programme, sort of the build up and everything, they actually start going live at 7:15 tomorrow night, I think.
Good,
is
yes.
the time.
So lots to carry. If you're not sure what to watch on telly tomorrow night, and I don't know about you, but in the last 11 months or so, we've had a little bit more time to watch television than normal, and I don't find much to watch that's on the regular schedule. So I'm looking forward to watching this tomorrow night. Hopefully it's been a help to you as well. So NASA landing on Mars tomorrow night. Now, we've had a few videos and stories and things from you. Thank you for that. Ken M0KJW says, "Hi David and Tammy. We had some wildlife come to visit us. It's just a quick iPhone video through our patio door. We watched her eating brambles, but you couldn't see her head until she stared to walk away." Have a look at this.
You don't often see them walking down the pavement, do you?
No, that's right. I mean, we do occasionally see them out here in the country, but to see them as bold as that, extraordinary, lovely video. So Ken and Shirley, thank you for sending us that. That's a lovely video, just taken as you do at the moment with the phone. Actually, I know we haven't planned on talking about this yet, but we are thinking about what to do for interactive. If you've been watching NARC Live for the best part of a year now, you'll know that one of the ones that we did as an informal was about wildlife. So we're wondering what to do maybe in March or April. If you think that would be a good idea, have a think about it and let us know what we could do. We could do another wildlife special, and I believe it was one of the most popular ones we ever did, wasn't it, Tammy?
I think it was, yeah.
Partly, I suppose, because we were on lockdown, and partly because most of us see some kind of wildlife, and you don't have to live in the country just to notice all the wildlife going around you. But anyway, have a think about it. Going from one type of wildlife to another, John 2E0TWQ sent us this, and he says it isn't just animals in the garden. With the snow and children playing, the animals also want to join in. Have a look at this.
Wow.
Oh, look at that. Oh, couldn't that just be a child doing that? Let's have another look.
It's just loving it, isn't it?
Absolutely. They're enjoying the Washington, D.C. snow.
Oh, dear.
And their pair are on loan to the Smithsonian Zoo. That's from the BBC. If you want to have a look at that, just search for BBC on their YouTube channel. I'm sure you'll find that on Catch Up. Wonderful stuff. Look at that.
See, I missed out when the snow was here. I obviously needed to go out and do some rolling in it.
I did wonder if you were going to be doing your snow angel trick. It was too cold, too cold. Anyway, wonderful stuff. There we are. Thank you very much, John, for sending us that link to that. You can see more of that on the BBC channel. Now, I should preface the next little piece by just telling you, those of you so many of you have been to see our premises here where we do this programme from, and when we do radio events in normal times during the year. And we live on and we live and work on a place called Bow Street in Great Ellingham. But this is what Stuart has sent us. This is what a headline, he said, and he knew this would grab my attention because this was the headline. Station reopening at Bow Street brings first trains for 56 years.
You've had trains for more than 56 years.
Oh, thanks. Shh.
Trains come every week here.
Well, I know they do, that's true, and you love trains. We both love trains, don't we, dear?
They're okay.
They're okay. Anyway, that was a lovely but it wasn't Bow Street in Great Ellingham. It is actually Bow Street near Aberystwyth in mid Wales. There we are. It's not the Bow Street on the Monopoly board either, Covent Garden one, as you can see there. So thanks, Stuart, for sending us that. You're right. When the email came in and the headline was, the actual subject of the email was station reopening at Bow Street brings first trains for 50 years. I was out of here like a shot. I didn't see any trains. Anyway, thanks for sending us that. Now, Colin M0GMK wrote to us to tell us about a special call sign calling CQ. This is GB80 ATC. ATC here stands for Air Training Corps, and they're celebrating their 80th anniversary on the 5th of February, so a couple of weeks ago. In 1941, Ofcom had issued the special event station call sign Golf Bravo 80 Alpha Tango Charlie, which is valid for use from the 5th, a few weeks ago, to the 4th of February next year, 2022. So if you hear that call sign going on, do listen out and do go back to them, because it might well be one of the Air Training Corps. And I have to say, at this point, I was a member of 231 Squadron, and it was the first, I think, time that I ever went on the radio was with 231 Squadron, the ATC, when I was sort of 14 or so, all those years ago. So I know a lot of other people are the same. Colin was the same, I think, very involved with the ATC, and lots of others as well. John G3XLL was actually the person who took me on the radio, I think, all those years ago. Anyway, I'm sure you've got your own memories as well if you've ever been a member of the ATC. But try and go back to them if you hear that call again. GB80ATC. Now, last week we did an unboxing and snow special. And I know that several of you were doing the contest, so hopefully you saw that we put the whole programme, all 2¼ hours of it, up on the YouTube channel. But if you did miss it and you want to have another look and you don't watch it on Facebook, then you can find it on the Norfolk Amateur Radio Club, or Norfolk ARC is actually called our YouTube channel. We put it up there as we thought that might be easier for some of you to watch there. And Tammy wasn't the only one making making Lego models, actually. You may have seen, do you want to show this here? What you made out of Lego? Lego?
I promised pictures of the thing from last week, so here goes my antenna array.
So this is what you missed when I gave Tammy what she didn't know what it was. She unboxed this box, she had no idea, and it was a box of just random Lego, not a predefined kit, and you made a model of a house with an aerial.
Yeah, I thought it was apt.
Apt, yes. Well, actually, Tammy wasn't the only one who made Lego last week, because on, I think it was Thursday night, unbeknown to her, I made her something. You've brought it with you, haven't you?
I have.
So I did some Lego making. Now, for the gentleman involved, you'll know that Sunday was the 14th of February, and that was Valentine's Day, and there we are. I made this rose for Tammy. It was a lot more COVID safe than going to a shop and getting some roses, and I can tell you as well that I looked upon this as an investment, because I've worked out that in 2.6 years, the return on investment will be such that that will be fully paid for. No, honestly, with index-linked increases in prices of roses and things, in 2.6 years, that will have paid for itself.
Excellent.
So if you finish with it for now, I'll take this away.
You just broke the top off it.
I thought you'd forget about it, and then next year I could give it back to you.
No, I'm keeping it. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe it's not such a good investment after all. Okay. So, Tammy, anyway. Little people. Little people.
Okay, well, actually, Bob, G6PWS, sent us a few pictures. So I've put them all on here. One of them is about radios. So it's Gru from the Minions. So saves up for a dream radio, buys dream radio. New model release. So saves up for a new dream radio.
And do you know...
The ones on the left are some little people... So we've got the Stonehenge made out of Weetabix.
I just noticed that. And when that came in, I didn't notice that. And some little miniature ones, shredding things. Yeah.
So that's really cool.
The crisps, they're crisps, are they?
They're crisps. That's you should know what crisps look like. You eat enough of them.
Thanks. Shh, they're listening. Oh, wow. That is really cool. Thank you very much, Bob, for sending us that. So what have you got for us this week, Tammy, with your little people?
Okay, so the little people this week is this cable car.
Oh, cool. Now, our guest tonight is watching this. I can just see him on another screen here, Rob. And that plug will mean more to him than it will probably to here. But if you've ever been to the States, you'll have seen a plug like that. That's their kind of mains plug over there. And isn't that brilliant?
Does look like a cable car, doesn't it?
It really does, and it's only when you break it down and you look at it and you realise what it's made of. So there we are. We show you one every week, but every day there's a new one on that. miniature-calendar.com if you want to have a look at those. So what have you been doing this week? Thanks for all the stuff you sent us, and if you haven't sent us anything this week, maybe you'll send us something for next week. We'd love to hear from you. Send it to this address, radio@dcpmicro.com. Email it to us absolute latest by 3 o'clock on Wednesday, and we'll feature it on the programme, as you can see we did today. Also, just like to tell you about and remind you about our special NARC card, which we send at least one a week pretty much out to anybody who you feel would be cheered up by a card from your club. Just send us an email with the name and address of who it's for. They don't have to be a radio amateur, they certainly don't have to be a member of the club or anything. Just if you feel they're feeling low, they've got a celebration, a birthday, or an anniversary or something like that, and they'd like a card from the club, just send us the name and address, and who you'd like to send it to, and we will be careful to be pleasure to sign it on behalf of you and on behalf of the club as well. Okay, it's time for that shack question. How many weeks are we on now, Tammy? Put you on the spot. Is it 40?
Week 46 this
46.
week.
46 times we've been doing this.
Yep.
This is someone else's shack. So we asked you this question: who works from a shack like this? Now this is a bit different. I think it's the first mobile shack we've shown, isn't it, Tammy? In those 46 programs.
Mine was a mobile shack.
Oh, that's true. Your car. Sorry. Yeah. Apart from that one.
Yeah.
This is clearly either a caravan or a mobile home. Got a very canine operator there. Maybe he's got a canine call sign. You never know. Who do you think worked from there? Have we had any guesses? Let's just have a look.
I don't think we've had any guesses online actually, because I've been keeping an eye on the comments.
Okay.
I think.
No.
No.
Okay. We haven't had any guesses. All right. Well, we've had plenty of entries. Kevin M0UJD thinks it's Ken M0KJW and Shirley G0ZAA's mobile shack.
Sunny M0SYW says the Hendry family, assuming Leanne or Belinda, as I don't think the pink nail polish would suit Colin.
And that's a bit of a theme that goes on actually here, because John 2E0TWQ thinks that it's Marshall M6DXL now 2E0TTN. He says, if I'm correct, the camper van and the ICOM 7100 gave it away to him because he sold him the 7100 and he mentioned it to him that he was going to put it in his camper van.
Paul G3VPT, would it be Mark and Moy M0MUI in their motorhome conversion? The only other person I know with a motorhome is Malcolm, but he doesn't. But he does not paint his nails.
Are we supposed to read that bit out? I don't know. Okay, and we didn't make that up. That's what Paul said. Honestly, Malcolm, letters to him, please. And Colin M0GMK says, I think it's the mobile shack of Moy M0MUI and Mark M0UMG and James M0XUI, and Polly, or P0LLY. I don't think the nail varnish is Mark's colour, so I guess it's Moy's hand. There's a theme there, isn't there?
We've had a couple of guesses online. Chris thinks that it's G0ODR. That's Colin, isn't it?
Okay, yeah. And Chris Danby thinks that as well. Chris.
No, and Andy.
Oh, Andy, I'm sorry.
M0NKR.
Yeah.
Thinks it's that as well.
Okay, so there we are. I don't know if we should allow guesses quite that late, but anyway.
Well, we haven't said it yet, have we?
No, we haven't said it yet. So whose shack it was, Tammy? Press that button.
It was Colin, G0ODR and family. So I believe that might be Belinda's hand.
Yeah, I hope so.
And I think the operator there is called Tommy.
Oh, yeah, he's lovely.
T0MMY.
Yes, yeah. It's a lovely shack.
Yeah.
So there we go. Lots of reasoned answers now who they thought it was. John, because he thought he sold him that radio. But anyway, that's whose shack it was. Well done, and thanks for entering, all of you who did entered that, and well done if you got it right. Let's have a look at this one now. This is a tricky one. Let's see who works from a shack like this. Now this might have you puzzled. When I first got an email from this person, this amateur, I only got the picture on the left. And I said, I can't possibly just publish that because how will anybody know? And is that a shack anyway? So with a bit of pressure, the person sent me another picture, the one on the right, and that shows what's inside that box. And they excuse it because, and I'm allowed to tell you this as a few clues, that it is an SDR. And in fact, the radio on the bottom right of that cabinet with a fan just above it is a Sun Pro 2 SDR. And the person explains that everything is in this box except for the computer that is used to run the SDR. So he thinks it's quite legitimate to say that this is his shack. He also goes on to say that there's no noise now, which he had when, I've said it's a he now, but never mind. He or she had it in the shack, and that the antennas go straight to that cabinet, so they don't have to put feeders into the house or anything. So there we are. A few little clues for you. Who do you know who's that keen on SDRs that their whole shack, apart from the computer side of it, is in the garden inside one of those waterproof boxes? If you know, drop us a line to that usual address, radio@dcpmicro.com by 3 p.m. at the latest next Wednesday, please. And then we'll reveal whose shack this was.
Was?
Sorry, yeah, it is. Whose shack it is. All right. So there's a different one for you. Now, just to tell you a few things happening on the at the club next week. Monday, 22nd of February, we've got the informal NARC net on GB3NB repeater at 7:30 with Steve G3EVA hosting. Now, this coming Monday, he's going to do the subject Desert Island Discs, favourite music, and which item would you take with you and which you couldn't do without. Now, you may think that sounds familiar because that's what he was
going to do that last week.
He was, but the reason he didn't is because the news broke about the RSGB proposing that they go from 0 to full license, and in fact the whole of the net was taken up by people discussing that for a couple of hours. So that's why the subject has been moved over to this coming Monday. So Desert Island Discs, basically, with your favourite music and the items that you would and wouldn't take, and your favourite companion as well. That's 7:30 on GB3NB. Plus, if you're into CW, there's a net at 8:30 just for you on 80 metres as well. Full details will be in the club newsletter as always. And then next Wednesday here for NARC Live, we're getting to know Ian Shepherd, G4 EVK. Now, you may not immediately know who that is, but as you can see on that slide, he is the chairman of the RSGB board at the moment, but he's had a busy life and a colourful life involved with radio and lots of other things as well, including the Lincoln Shortwave Club, which has just celebrated its 100th years, its centenary, which is a very long time. And the reason why Lincoln Shortwave Club is significant now as well is because they're the ones who co-organise the Hamfest, the National Hamfest with the RSGB, which is probably our most major now radio rally every year as well. So Ian will be giving us an insight into Lincoln Shortwave Club and also his work in the RSGB, which must be one of the most challenging and difficult years for a society, and all the things that they've done to adapt to this online world. So I hope like me, you're looking forward to meeting Ian next week on NARC Live at 7:30. Plus all the regular stories and things, please keep sending them to us. As you can see, we use them and it's great. It makes great fun for the first 20 minutes or so of the programme. And send them to this address. It's radio@dcpmicro.com. There we go. That slide at the bottom of the programme. So send us those stories, pictures, videos, whatever you like to do. And also, don't forget that we have our Norfolk on the Air slide. Here we are. That's on our website at all times. Someone did write to me and say, where is it? We do have several pages to our website. So if it's not on the front page, you could just go along a couple of pages and you'll see that slide will be there, and we keep it nice and up to date for you as well. If you want something added to that, it doesn't have to be a Norfolk Amateur Radio Club event. Any other nets, we're very happy to publicise them as well. And don't forget about the card, as I said. If you want us to send one of these cards to anybody, let us know. Now, at nearly 7:55 now, we're on to our main event. And for tonight, we're going to be talking to somebody whose name has become synonymous with the technical ratings of radios in our hobby, amateur radios. Most of you will have heard of the Sherwood rating, especially if you've looked into a radio and tried to decide what's best for you, maybe the features or performance that you're particularly looking for. And I'm really pleased to say that Rob Sherwood is with us now tonight, all the way from Colorado and Denver tonight. So let's welcome Rob to our program. Rob.
Hello, David and Tammy. Nice to be here.
It's lovely to see you, Rob. And before we go on to talk about what you've been doing and what you do to give us this performance, maybe you'd just like to tell us a little bit about the weather in America. And the reason I say that is we've just got rid of our snow here in Norfolk. But I heard an amazing fact on the radio this morning that nearly 70% of the states is covered by snow at the moment. So is that affecting you at the moment?
Oh, definitely not. The snow's up in the mountains where it belongs for the skiers. But there's lots of snow in Texas and cold weather, and then I guess it's moving east. So we have our share.
Oh, good. All right. Well, Rob, we're really looking forward to finding out how you do these wonderful ratings. I don't know if you realise that, I'm sure you do, that your name isn't just synonymous with rating radios in the States, but it's probably worldwide, and certainly here in Britain. A lot of the traders who advertise all the radios and things like that often quote your ratings. So we're really looking forward tonight to finding out how you get these ratings and what you do. So Over to you, Rob. And by the way, to those of you at home, if you've got any questions for Rob at any time during his talk, and also we'll have a couple of specific breaks as well, then you can ask them online on BATC or on Facebook at any time. But now let's go back to Rob.
Okay, very good. Well, as you might expect, I'm going to be talking about transceiver performance, and that is including transmitters specifically, and more the last few years. So sometimes we'll find that the other guy's transmitter is really the limitation. So let's look at this. What I don't want you to do is to focus on just a few transceivers. I started testing receivers in 1976, and the choices we have today of fine equipment are just amazing. There are some challenges, so let's see what's in front of us. I get questions on emails about my chart, which hopefully you've seen some of it, and why don't I sort the chart by sensitivity? Because it's sorted by what I call close-in dynamic range. Well, sensitivity has been around for a very long time, and if we go back in time, here's 3 examples. An R390A, 1954, has a sensitivity rating in microvolts of 0.2 microvolts, and a Drake R4C that I'm known for having kits for it, 0.2 microvolts. And of course, a modern K3S with a preamp number 1 turned on, 0.2 microvolts. So you'll see that it's really not been an issue having enough sensitivity with radios from long ago. What is a problem and getting worse is urban noise, and this can be significant. RFI from all sorts of sources. So, what is sensitivity that has been around for that length of time? What's a 10 dB signal plus noise to ratio in the sideband bandwidth? And I listed in microvolts because before 1975, that's how everybody rated them. And maybe you've got an older radio or you want to compare it to a new one. So I still list sensitivity in microvolts. But the noise floor, which is the new way to do something equivalent, and that's in a CW bandwidth, it's a 3 dB signal plus noise to noise ratio. But if we look at those 3 examples I just gave on sensitivity, well, look, their noise floors are virtually identical. So that doesn't change. But local noise is our bugaboo, and I'm sure it's the same thing you've got there in the UK. I moved to Denver in 1969, and I'd say over 50 years, the noise has gone up about 3 dB per decade. And the noise can be line noise, which doesn't seem to be as well controlled as in the past. Wall warts, we charge all sorts of things. Of course, our cell phones and who knows what. They used to just be a transformer and a diode or two, but now they're a switching power supply in those little tiny chargers. And that makes RFI. Of course, all our computers have switching power supplies. And our appliances, our dishwasher, our washing machine, our refrigerator, it may well have a microprocessor if it's a fairly new model, and that puts out interference. Sometimes LED light bulbs do, and then different types of DSL for broadband, that can cause interference too. And we're not lucky in Colorado because they have grow lights for growing pot, as some of the other states do, and some of my friends in Boulder have noises going like a mile away from somebody growing that in their basement. So that's kind of a problem we have today.
That's not something I expected you to say, Rob. Sorry about that.
Well, luckily I don't have it where I live, but my friends do. The main performance that I've been talking about since in really 1976 or 77 was dynamic range. And we kind of talk about, well, the magic 100 dB radio, and it's not hard to find today. If we go back 20 or 30 years, no such thing existed. So the tremendous improvement in receivers is what we are blessed with, even if the transmitters are not the case. So okay, dynamic range, what is that? Well, that has to do with the ability of you to receive and work a very weak station that's surrounded by strong stations without the receiver making its own interference. And for a long time, we had up conversion radios that had a dynamic range of about 70 dB, plus or minus some. And those were all in the close-in measurement as opposed to the wide-space measurement. So testing has changed over time. And really the up-conversion radio that we knew for all those decades is pretty much gone today from the standpoint of anything new. We'll probably never see a new one. Really, the only current up-conversion radio is the ICOM 7851, which is very expensive. But the average up-conversion radio was a compromise on CW and RTTY, particularly contests and pileups, de-expeditions. It worked okay on sideband, and I'll show you why. But in the last couple of years, we've got some really exciting changes. The hybrid superhets that have come out from Kenwood and Yaesu. And then the direct sampling radios are becoming more and more popular with the couple of new ICOMs, the VHF unit, and then a portable unit. And really the K4 that maybe you heard about for like 21 months, we know of at least one that's shipped to a regular customer and not a beta tester. So there's another direct sampling radio. So what numbers on my chart or any type of review are we going to look at that's really important in a multi-signal environment? I mean, if you're on the air and let's say you're on 10 meters and there's one other station on the band, none of this matters. But usually we've got a lot more interference than that to deal with. So we talk about close-in dynamic range, and that's the measurement with a 2 kc bandwidth as opposed to wide-spaced at 20. Noise floor, and I just said, noise floor is not an issue as far as your radio being adequate, but we need that number to do the calculation of the dynamic range. Reciprocal mixing dynamic range, that's a new term as of 2012, and the league coined that term. It has to do with the quality of the synthesizer in your radio. And we'll talk about that. What is hardly ever mentioned is transmitted broadband composite noise. Okay, composite noise, what is that? Well, that's phase noise plus the AM component. Some radios, the AM component may be worse than the phase component. So that, what we hear on the air is composite noise. We don't know whether it's one or the other, it's just a combination of the two. Well, we all know what splatter is on sideband. The guy that's up the band a ways, and he shouldn't be splattering into our passband, but maybe he is. Or if you're a CW operator, you certainly run into key clicks in a big contest when you're trying to work a really weak guy and there's a guy close by is clicking away, and that's not desirable either. Okay, let's just describe what a dynamic range means. And this was defined in QST in Ham Radio Magazine, what dynamic range and noise floor were, as opposed to in the past, all we had really was sensitivity and maybe cross modulation that we don't hear about today. We have two equal strength signals fed into the receiver, have to be very well isolated, and we increase those two signals until the third order dynamic intermod product is equal to the noise floor. Well, you've probably seen pictures in your RSGB, or if you happen to subscribe to QST, of intermodulation pictures of a transmitter or of an amplifier. Well, it's the same thing. You have third order, fifth order, etc. But we're just worried about the third order because that's the one that pops up first. So we've adjusted those signals so that the third order distortion product equals the noise floor, which is that same 3 dB signal to noise ratio, because the signal and the noise add together and pop up 3 dB. So if the radio happened to have a noise floor of minus 128 dBm and the test signals happen to be minus 28 dBm, well, there's our magic 100 dB radio. But for instance, like a TS 590SG, the number's 92, so it can be anything. This reciprocal mixing dynamic range, here's a little graphic that I found on the web that's really cute. The little bullet nose signal there on the left, that's the weak guy we're trying to work, and maybe he's DXCC number 100 for you, or he's a multiplier in a contest, and you really want to work that guy. But there might be a really strong signal nearby, and that can be a perfect signal, which of course a perfect signal doesn't exist, but it doesn't matter. And you say, well, I don't listen to my local oscillator. Why do I care if it has noise on it? Well, the noise on our local oscillator can mix with a strong signal that's nearby, and it puts noise sidebands on that strong signal, and that may overlap the weak signal. Now, this graphic assumes that the noise on the local oscillator falls off fairly quickly, and we would hope that it does, but it may not. There are some radios that the noise doesn't get better at 100 kilohertz or 200 kilohertz or 300 kilohertz. So in that case, it would be a much worse problem because the guy could be up the band 100 or 200 kilohertz and still cause a problem. So the devil's in the details as far as reading reviews. One thing I want to recommend is, at least in QST, and I don't know what happens in RSGB, but Bob Allison, who's the laboratory technician, engineer at the ARRL, he writes a sidebar in a lot of the reviews. And he wrote an explanation of reciprocal mixing dynamic range, the phase noise performance over your radio, in April 2012 and May of 2016. So if you wanted more details and you happen to be a subscriber to the ARRL, you can download those issues. Well, actually, for about 20 years or more, the synthesizers in our radios really weren't very good. And often the radio's phase noise performance was more significant than the third order dynamic range. And here's kind of the worst example that was in QST. Some of the ads in the magazine said the dynamic range of the FTDX 3000 was 106 dB. Now, I don't know where that came from, but the league said it was 100. And that was surprising to me because I'd already published the performance on my website, and I said it was 82. But in my case, the worst case number gets published. If it was third order dynamic range, that goes in the dynamic range column in the number. If it was phase noise limited, I put that number in, and I put a footnote saying it was phase noise limited. Well, if you read this review, that information was really there. Not too well pointed out, but it also said 82 dB. So if you've got a radio that says the dynamic range is 100 because it was measured with a 1 hertz filter to eliminate the phase noise, so you can make that measurement, which might be interesting to the engineer who designed it, but not to you and I on the air. So the 82 number is what's important, and the bigger number is just kind of there as not much usefulness. Well, the same thing happened in March of 2020 when the Zygu G90, it's a little QRP rig, it was reviewed. Now the difference between the measurement with a narrow filter, like 3 hertz or something, wasn't as dramatic as with that Yaesu, but it was still 91 dB versus 84. So if you've got two measurements that are supposed to describe how well the receiver will do in a difficult environment, you look at the lower number. The other thing that was interesting in Bob's review, he said you'd have mediocre keying sidebands. What's that mean? Key clicks. It had key clicks. The sideband intermodulation splatter wasn't too good, and the transmit phase noise, the composite noise in this case would be the total noise. He says it's bad enough, don't use an amplifier with it. Well, if you're out on a soda site up on a hilltop or a mountaintop, you probably don't have an amp, so that's fine. But if you're using it at home, he really recommended you don't want to do that. We need to be good neighbors. We share the frequencies, as you know, and if someone's taking up 2 or 3 times the bandwidth that's appropriate, that's not fair to everybody else. Just real quickly in the fine print again, there was also a measurement for this G90 of its blocking value, a big number, well, sort of big number, 121. A K3S, for instance, is 150. But then the reciprocal mixing dynamic range was 84. So again, 84 is kind of the real limit, even though there was this number published of 121. So I said for about 20 years or maybe 25, we often found that the synthesizer in your radio was the limit. But there are now some legacy radios and then some hybrid radios that this is no longer the case. Our manufacturers have finally learned how to design really good synthesizers for radios that we can afford to purchase. The K3S has a much better synthesizer. If the K3 you'd had for years isn't upgraded, consider doing it. The 7851, you'd hope at that expensive price would be very good, and it is. But then in the more reasonable price range of, of $3,000 or less, the FTDX 101D or the MP or the new FTDX 10 or the newer Kenwood, the TS890S, they have tremendous synthesizers, no longer a problem. Now, we've now got at least 3 companies, and now almost 4 if we include Elecraft, that have direct sampling radios. And with the direct sampling radio, if you put in a good clock oscillator, the reference oscillator, because every direct sampling radio has to have a crystal oscillator of some sort. If you put in a good one, phase noise is not a problem. So that's one advantage that the direct samplings have on, even on the inexpensive 7300. That's $1,000 in the US. Maybe it's like 1,300 pounds in the UK. So if we have any questions at this point, before we get into some other details, let our David ask away.
Okay, well, we haven't had any yet. We have obviously encouraged people to ask questions. So if you've got a question for Rob right now on anything that he's talked about so far, then please, by all means, ask them quickly now on Facebook or on BATC. I'm just, I'm going to leave it. I have been sent one question by email, Rob, and I'm going to leave that because you haven't really covered that part of the things yet. One thing I was going to ask, and you might be covering this later, so forgive me if that's the case, but where do you get your radios from? Now that you're well known for this, do the manufacturers sort of just send you a radio to say, will you please review this? Or do you get it from suppliers, or do you have to, you presume you don't have to go and buy them all. So where do you get the radios from?
Okay, and that's changed a bit. And I want to be guaranteed a random sample. So for instance, Kenwood is the best at that. When the 990 came out, or the 890 came out, I went to Ham Radio Outlet in Denver, Colorado, and went in their back room and picked a random box off the shelf. And I tested that, and then it, of course, was returned to Kenwood. Ham's loaned me radios, thank goodness. Now I own radios, so if I happen to buy it, then I test it that way. But with our local club, I've gotten radios from our local club members. People ship me radios. For instance, the 101D came from a ham in New York just in time for the Dayton Hamvention that year that it came out. I had like 10 days to get it tested in time. And I have bought a couple radios recently. People were so interested in the ICOM 705, the little QRP radio that's 160 through 70 centimeters, that it wasn't too expensive, and so I purchased that. I may not keep it, but it's in such demand that I can find a new home. And I did buy the new Yaesu 10 because people were just really wondering how that compared to the 101. So it's different, but I would say if you go over the last 30 years or 40 years, for the most part, they were in some cases borrowed from the ham radio store. In other cases, loaned by other amateurs. So thank goodness for helpful hams.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I have had a couple of questions sent to me now. Feel free if you'd rather leave them till a little bit later on, if that fits in better. But Chris G4CCX says, have you ever done a test on the Expert Electronics MB1?
I tried to, and unfortunately, that didn't work out well. It was very early in the production cycle, and it was sent to me. It was set up for a 160 meter CW contest. I did have to get some help from the people in Russia via sharing our computer, because I couldn't get it to talk to my computer for logging. And we pulled her hair out. You couldn't get the serial port to work. They eventually installed some software on the MB1 and on my computer that talked Ethernet between the two. But I also couldn't get it to key an amplifier consistently. I had an Alpha 89, an ACOM 1000, and that couldn't consistently key the linear, which was a total head scratcher. And then I broke for dinner on the day before the contest and came back in the shack, and the radio was dead. So at that point, that was the end of it. So it got sent off to someplace else here in the States. The following Dayton like 4 or 5 months later, I asked what happened to this thing, and they said the CPU went out. But the funny thing was it would still transmit. So I don't think I really know what happened. So it just didn't work out. Unfortunately, I don't have any data on it, but that's been from 3 years ago, and hopefully those type of infant mortality things are way behind them.
Yeah, okay. So that was early days, I guess, for it. And but you would, in principle, then, I mean, from what you've just said as well, if somebody sent you one of those now, an MB1 to test, you would be happy to do that?
Oh, sure. Right.
Okay. Jim G3YLA asks, is there a different performance typically from a receive-only input?
No, and I mean it's really meant for an RX antenna, and I do use it for testing. And of course, I've compared the two between the standard input and the RX input, but they're identical. But you can't transmit by mistake into your signal generator. So it's a very good way to test things is to use the RX input. But otherwise, it's there for your beverage or your flag antenna or something like that. But there should be no reason. Now there could be minor differences in the ESD protection or something like that. But if you're just measuring noise floor, it doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And by the way, Chris G4CCX, who asked the first question about the MB1, says that, okay, thank you, and it's fine now. So I guess he's got one of those radios and he finds it very good. Anyway, that's all the questions that we've got at the moment, Rob. So we'll hand back to you, and we'll return with some other questions later on. But if you've got questions at home at any point that you want to ask, just put them onto either BATC or Facebook, and we'll read them to Rob later.
Okay, so today, of the newer stuff, we have two types of transceivers. We still have the super het, which is no surprise, hybrid or not, and the direct sampling. Now, what does the hybrid mean? It's got a super het radio, but it also has a direct sampling band scope and waterfall. And the resolution of a direct sampling waterfall and band scope is massively better than what we had before. The first band scope I ever had was in an ICOM 781, and it had a CRT in it. And so then eventually, of course, they went to LCD. They both work, and they both have their strengths and weaknesses, but I'd say in certain environments, the super het with a roofing filter definitely has an advantage if you've got really strong signals nearby. Like, I guess you have a field day in the UK. We'd certainly do here in the US. So you've got a bunch of stations, bunch of transceivers all set up within a 1,000-foot radius. And that's a challenge. But you may have a ham a few blocks away, a mile away. So if you're looking at signals that are like S9 plus 70 or 80, just unusually strong signals, from a blocking standpoint, the super het will eventually block. I mean, it goes into gain compression. Now, a direct sampling radio doesn't block. It's either fine or the ADC is an overload. But that difference can be 20 to 25 dB. So there were times, if you've got signals of those enormous levels, that the super het or the super het hybrid would be an advantage. So for the direct sampling, which of course now we have Flex and Apache and ICOM and now Elecraft, if you have that type of signal that's 70 or 80 over 9, that's going to be a challenge unless you turn in some attenuation. But the other difference is the front end of a direct sampling radio for all but the Flex 6600, which has a bandpass filter for just the ham band. Most all of them have a half octave filter. Well, those half octave filters went way back to when we first started getting general coverage receivers. So that can be a lot of megahertz, like on 20 meters, the front end of a direct sampling radio, like a 7300 or an Apache, or most of the Flex, would be several megahertz wide. And there's commercial stations in there probably running more power than we're running. Now, some of the radios have a tracking pre-selector like the FTDX 101 or the 7610. That'll help for out of our band signals. So again, the roofing filter has an advantage in those cases. But luckily, we don't see 70 and 80 over 9 signals all that much. So features that are desirable. Well, the radios are so good today on receive that features and price may have a lot to do with what you pick. QSK, or at least click-free semi-break-in. I don't want to be hearing a lot of extraneous noise in a contest that I'm operating for tens of hours. I like the CW to be nice and quiet as far as not clicking as I go back and forth between receive and transmit. An audio peak filter is really an advantage, and the middle tier and upper tier radios have that for CW. I don't try to reduce the bandwidth narrower than my DSP bandwidth, but it takes out noise. So anything that can reduce noise in a long operating span reduces your fatigue. So that's really important. I won't buy a radio today that doesn't have a band scope or a waterfall because I'm a contester, or if our DXpeditions return, which of course have often been canceled now due to COVID, that it's nice to be able to look at the pileup and see where there's a space to drop my signal in. We want a good, efficient user interface between the ham, the user, and the radio, and we don't want to have to go into a bunch of menus to adjust something that we would normally want to adjust in our operating time. Of course, the logging program needs to be rock solid. I happen to like a tuning knob, even if I'm running a computer-controlled radio. That's an option, and of course, if you like running it with your knob and the wheel, that's fine. Well, there's many models today that work extremely well and are probably better than we typically need. So I always say, for most of the time, for most of us, we don't need the absolute top performance receiver. Thank goodness, because maybe that's out of our price range. But whatever you own, we can run it to an optimum way, and I'll show you how to do that. Sometimes, when we can't copy, it's the other guy's signal that's up the band a few kcs. So what's the state of the art today from every brand? We've got 6 major brands. And really, if you're brand centric and you've been happy with your brand for years, there's no reason you have to change, because we can now buy a 95 dB or better radio from everyone. The reciprocal mixing, clean synthesizers now better than ever. So the kinds of radios that have this performance, well, the ICOM line, the Flex 6000, the Apache Anon, the Elecraft K3, we'll hopefully get to see a K4 sometime soon, the new Kenwood, and the 2 new Yaesus. The receiver performance is just outstanding. So are you going to choose a new rig? Well, it somewhat will depend on what you think you're missing and what your budget is. Maybe you say, I need really top performance because I've got a ham that's half a mile away. So you can look at the numbers, the lab numbers, and it'll give you an idea there. But there's other things that you really need to look at today. What features do you need? Maybe you are do digital FT8 and you want one USB cable to your computer and you can be off and running. The ergonomics are certainly important to me in a contest. If you're fumbling around with the radio, that's waste time and you hurt your score. Firmware feature enhancements. Now, probably when a radio first comes out, maybe all the features aren't there. I know there have been some big enhancements on the older ICOMs. And you know, when the K4 is finally in the hands of many operators, they aren't going to have that feature rich right off the bat. So that's important. And then bug updates. That's something that sometimes is handled really poorly. I know there's a ham's keeping track of the bugs in the 101D, and it's like 40 or 50 of them, and they haven't been addressed in months and months. So we need to have bug fixes come out regularly. And you know that everything's got surface mount today, and I don't know how you can see the parts. Sometimes they're the size of a grain of salt. So factory service is really important, and hopefully available at a reasonable cost and a reasonable turnaround time. And we do need to consider total cost of ownership over the life of the radio, 5 or 10 years anyway. And sometimes the cost of a repair can be a significant fraction of the radio, so you need to keep that in mind. Well, here's sort of a compendium of my page where I have all that 150 radios, but this is the top 21 not number 1 through 21 as far as starting at the top and just counting down. This is the top 21 individual models. That's because there's multiple listings for some of them. For instance, the K3 came out in 2008, and it was upgraded over time with some new options. The K3S came out. Then at one point I compared a K3S to a Flex 6700 on 10 meters. And so there was more than one listing. Also, with the direct sampling radios, there's more variation from unit to unit. Now, it isn't like the radio's different, it's the chip. It's the ADC chip, the analog to digital conversion chip. They're not identical. They're not peas in a pod. So there would be several dB difference between when I test one radio or another radio of the same type, but the chip, of course, is different. Or maybe it's got two chips in it, like the 7610, and those two radios, two receivers in the same radio, don't test identically. So let's just look at the middle of this page. Right there in the middle, we've got a 100 dB radio. Now, this is astounding. If we go back 20 years, 30 years, we didn't have 100 dB radios. So luckily, we don't really need 100 dB most of the time. Well, I put the little ICOM 705, which is one of the newest. It's an 88 dB radio, and that performs quite well. And then we go clear up to the 110 or 107 for the new Yaesu radios. So we've got amazing choices, and we look at cost, $1,000 US to more than 12,000. Well, the 7300 is just a bargain, and for a new ham, you can't go wrong. I've probably run 8 contests with the 7300. Of these 21 radios, I've operated 15 of them in contests, and some of them several times. But you don't need to spend a fortune. N2IC is a big contester in the U.S. He used to live in the Denver area. Now he's down in New Mexico, but he has a pair of TS 590s. A new 590 is like 1,400, and a used one might be 650. So you can get top performance. And really, what's important? Your location, you can't maybe do much about it, but that affects it. Your antenna certainly does. And in a contest, of course, your operating skills do. So here, N2IC has medium-priced radios and really is a great contester with big scores. So let me make some brief comments on the two newest radios that have come through my lab and my shack out in the country. The 705, well, it's about the size of a brick and weighs about 2.5 pounds or a little over a kilogram. It covers 160 through 70 centimeters. Its lab numbers are virtually identical to a 7300 with IP plus turned off. Well, what does that mean? Well, most radios today that are direct sampling have some sort of linearization feature for the ADC chip. ICOM happens to call it IP plus. It helps the lab numbers, but so far on the air, we haven't been able to hear the difference. But we're mostly listening on the lower bands, and distortion that's in a direct sampling radio has a little more distortion all the time than its super head, but it's pretty weak. It's probably below band noise on the lower bands. What we don't know is, will that linearization feature be more important in a few years when 10 meters is hopping and we've got really strong signals that stay on 10 meters? I don't think we know the answer to that. So anyway, in reference to 705, it doesn't have that feature, but otherwise it just works extremely well. I haven't used the VHF features, but the ergonomics were great. The scope works great. It's the same size as the 7300 scope. So if you're used to any ICOM, the user interface is virtually identical, aside from like the VHF features, satellites. So all these work the same. If you can work one, you can work the other. On the FTDX10, its lab numbers are almost as good as the 101. The ergonomics were a challenge. I'll get into that if someone wants to talk about that in Q&A. For me, I'm a search and pounce CW operator in contests. I wait for the other guys to call CQ and I work them. Well, the funny thing is, for me, a waterfall gives me a history of 30 seconds or more, depending on the speed that I set the waterfall. But when you transmit, if only with one dit on the CW key, the waterfall goes away on the new Yaesus. And I don't understand that. I don't hear much about people complaining about it, but for me, that negates the value, and I use the waterfall extensively. So that just seems strange to me. ICOM doesn't do that. Flex doesn't do that. Apache doesn't do that. So I don't understand why the ICOM does it. I'm sorry, why the Yaesu does it. Now, for these contests, when I ran the 705, I was not running a QRP. I don't do QRP operating in a major contest. So I drove an amplifier. I used it in sweepstakes. That's a US contest sideband. I worked 100 just for fun. I wanted a headset, but the headset I could find was meant for an HT, and the Vox didn't work unless I pushed the push to talk button. Well, I don't want to have to hold that in the whole time. So I only worked 100 stations, but it worked really well. I did give it a good ring out on the ARRL 160 meter CW contest, and I worked almost 400 stations, S&P only. And I worked 2 JAs, so you can't say, well, you're not going to be able to copy weak signals thousands of miles away on the 705. But that was no problem. I had over 80 sections, and I was on the air for, 16 hours or more. I did also operate the 705 on 10 meters, which is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. I work contests on 10 and 160 on purpose because that's kind of the gamut of what the bands are like. Since I didn't have a Vox, I only operated part of the 10-meter contest on sideband with the 705, but I did operate it on CW2. Well, I was running out of contests when I finally got the FTDX10, so I used it in the CQ Worldwide 160-meter contest. I didn't have as much time to operate because I had a house guest, but I worked over 200 stations. I worked 3 JAs that morning. We worked JAs about sunrise in Colorado. I had plenty of sections. I was on the air for over 7 hours. The ergonomics were an issue for me, and there are some firmware bugs that have to be fixed. But the basic operation was fine. The selectivity was fine. The audio peak filter worked. The tuning was fine. So, the radio works, and maybe some of the things that least bother me will be addressed with firmware updates. I'm going to call the K4 the elephant in the room because people have been asking me for like a year, have you tested the K4? Well, of course not, because it hadn't shipped. We know of one person in the US that has one now that's not a beta tester. Maybe there's 2 by now. So, well, we don't know for sure what the performance is. We can make some guesses, but we do know the architecture. So if you have a basic K4, it's going to be kind of like half of a 7610. It'll have 1 ADC and 1 set of bandpass filters. But you can have 2 receivers, preferably on the same band. But if you had 2 receivers on 2 different bands, the bandpass filter would have to go broadband. The K4D dual, that's going to have 2 ADC chips and 2 sets of bandpass filters. So that'll be just like the ICOM. So we can kind of guess. Almost all the direct sampling radios are around 100 dB. A little bit less, a little bit more, but nothing drastic. So that's probably where that will come in as far as on the chart. No idea when we'll get to see an HD, maybe the end of the year, but that's going to add a super het module plus roofing filters to the K4D, and it'll be just like an FTDX 101D or MP as far as the architecture. So we kind of assume that it'll work like a K3S. So that would be our hope. It does surprise me the price of a K4 in the US, and it's kind of an expensive radio. So here's a listing of the popular radios today. Kind of the sweet spot for medium priced radios is kind of around $3,000, but the K4 is going to be more than that. If you want to see the details in this, I can send you the PDF of this presentation. You can get the details on that. So how are we going to make our radio work the best way possible, whatever your radio is? And I'm going to show you some slides of screen captures on some radios here. But what do I mean by net gain? Well, a radio has to have enough sensitivity, enough gain to take a fraction of a microvolt signal at the antenna and put out plenty of audio into the speaker or our headphones. We can adjust that net gain, though, by an attenuator, which will reduce the net gain, or by adding a preamp, which will add net gain. You're probably going to need a preamp in a quiet location on 15 and above. The lower bands, we've got too much gain and too much sensitivity. As a matter of fact, a radio that will work on 10 or even 6 now, of course, all the radios cover 6 meters. The band noise on 10 meters is 30 dB quieter than 160. So if we're on 80 and 160, we have sensitivity that is way beyond what we need. So we can use attenuation to our advantage, and I'll explain why that is. A preamp, though, in the lower bands may be something you need if you've got a receive antenna, a beverage or a flag or something like that, or a loop. So this dynamic range that I'm talking about, which means the radio isn't going to cause its own interference, and whatever it is, just consider it a window. And we can move the window up by adding the attenuator, which will make it less prone to overload, or we can move it down when we need more sensitivity on the upper bands. And the dynamic range doesn't change one bit if we add the attenuator. It just moves it. But if we add a preamp, if it's designed right, it probably doesn't change at all, or maybe 1 dB or 2 dB. You'd never notice that. So your dynamic range is fixed, but where you place it depends on what band you're on and where you should optimize it. Here's a screen capture of the ARRL 10-meter contest in 2018. I was using the Kenwood TS890S. You can see, even though the sunspots were probably at minimum 2018 and wasn't very good last year either, there were more than 20 stations in a 10 kc bandwidth. Now this is how I run a contest on CW. I have a 10 kc bandwidth on 10 meters and maybe on 165, but anyway, in either case, there were plenty of stations that work. Some were very weak. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, you'll see preamp 1 is on. Okay, it's 10 meters, and I'm out in the country. The lower right-hand corner, the audio peak filter is on because it reduces noise. In this case, since the QRM wasn't terrible, you can see I had a bandwidth of 350 hertz on my DSP bandwidth, and the bandwidth of the APF was about 300. So it rolled off the noise, and that reduces fatigue. It's tiring to listen to noise for 10 hours at a time. Well, here's a week before the 160 meter contest. There are over 30 stations in 10 kilohertz. Now look at the QRM there. Well, let's look at some of my settings. If we look in sort of the upper middle of the LCD screen, I had my audio peak filter on, just like on 10 meters. But over on the left, I had my 12 dB attenuator. Well, why was that? Well, on 160, if you've got locals around, we mostly use top-loaded verticals on 160. You can have signals that are extremely strong that are 10 or 20, 30 miles away. So we can add attenuation because I mentioned before, the band noise on 160 is 30 dB stronger at night than band noise is on 10 meters in the daytime. So since the radio works on 10 or 6, we've got this sensitivity to burn. Well, the other reason, though, is we really don't want the AGC to run on band noise. There's no point in that. Now, if we tune in between a station and the S meter's reading upscale, or on some of the Brex samplings, it's done a little differently, but there's no reason for that band noise in between a station to be just as loud as every station we work. So I like to set the Agc threshold on this radio, for instance. If I punched in the 6 dB attenuator, I'll bet that nobody's band noise went down on 160 as far as the noise coming out the speaker or your headphones, because it's still going to be running the band noise is going to be running the AGC. So if I punch in 12 dB attenuation, if we're lucky, maybe the band noise coming out the speaker went down a little bit, and that's a good place to start. With the 7610, you can actually adjust that in 3 dB steps, so maybe I pick 15 dB. One contest I ran when I had nothing new to test. I often have 2 radios going at the same time, so I can compare a reference radio and a new radio, or maybe 2 new radios. Well, there wasn't any new radio at all to test this one year, so I hauled out the TS990S and the little 7300. Now, those are vastly different radios that cost $7,500 versus $1,000, but I wanted to give it an equal chance, so I ran the attenuator on the 7300 at 20 dB. That's the only choice, unfortunately. I wish it had a 10 dB attenuator and a 20 dB, but it doesn't. So to make it fair, I took the Kenwood and set it on 18. So that was the first time I'd actually run 18 or 20 dB attenuation, and actually, I loved it. Now, occasionally, I had to turn the volume up when I worked a station that was weaker than my Agc threshold that I had adjusted, but that was like 5% of the time or 3% of the time. So everybody else I was working, they were within Agc range, but when I was tuning in between stations, band noise almost wasn't there. Oh, was that a relief? And then the QRM would drop off later in the night, I'd be tuning around trying to find a station, and I just didn't have to hear all that noise in my earphones. So what else did this picture show that I had no idea when I captured the picture? So look at the station on the left. It says key clicks 5X. Now that station has terrible key clicks and he's way too wide. If we look over on the right, we see another station that says clean. Now he's maybe 3 dB weaker, so that's insignificant. But look how narrow his signal is. And even on the waterfall, it's even more dramatic how narrow that station is. But if we compare it to the station on the left, the waterfall looks terrible. He's way too wide. And then if you look really closely, you can see a little tiny signal trying to peek up through his key clicks. You can see it on the band scope as that little blip. You can see it in the waterfall. I'd have trouble probably working that weak station. And maybe it was a multiplier. Maybe it was a new country. Who knows? So there's no excuse for having key clicks that are 5 times as bad as somebody else. And there is a way to adjust that on newer radios. I don't think is too well understood. So we'll cover that in a moment. What about sideband? How wide is our signal? Well, right now, there's only one brand, the Apache brand, that has something called pure signal, or that's pre-distortion. Now, cell phone towers and receivers, they use transmitters, they use pre-distortion. TV transmitters use pre-distortion that cleans up distortion products. Well, this station I'm talking to with the pure signal, he likes wide sideband, the ESSB. He picked his bandwidth on purpose, over 4 kilohertz. Now, I wouldn't do that, but the point is, this guy's signal is straight up and down. There's no splatter you can see. But if we look at the guy on the left, that is not unusual to see that kind of splatters products on a sideband station. So right now, Apache is the only one offering it. Flex has talked about it for like 8 years. And Elecraft says the K4 will have pre-distortion once they get it feature rich. Here's something embarrassing for me. I'm talking on 75 meters to a relatively local group. That's my signal at the bottom because I'm on a rig that doesn't have pre-distortion. And then the next guy to talk had an Apache, and look how narrow he is compared to my signal. So I wish I had a signal that looked like the one that's narrow, but I don't. So we've talked about using your attenuator and how to adjust it. Adjust the attenuation with the attenuator or your RF gain until band noise drops when you're in between stations. But how do we know when to turn on your preamp? You might say, well, just leave it on all the time, but that's not a good idea. So let's look at 10 meters and 6 meters. I'm using a pair of 5-element beams, one on 10 and one on 6, and I'm going to compare antenna noise gain. Now to do that, it'd be nice if you have a dummy load and you can hook it up to an antenna switch, so you can go back and forth between your dummy load and your antenna tuned in between stations, a dead spot on the band. And we want to see how much band noise goes up when we switch between the dummy load and the antenna. Now in this case on 10 meters, it only went up 3 dB with the preamp off. And that's a key number because that means the receiver is creating half the noise. Well, we don't want that. But if we turned on preamp 1 on 10 meters, the antenna noise gain went up almost 10 dB. In that case, the receiver is contributing almost no noise. And that's what we want. We don't want the receiver to be the receiving limit. On 6 meters, it's even worse. I use a meter, of course, to make this measurement. You can do it by ear. Well, on 6 meters, you can hardly hear your antenna connect if you're in a quiet location. And in that case, preamp 1 increased the band noise 4.5 dB, which means the receiver was contributing about a third of the noise. But if we turned on preamp 2, we're back to almost 10 dB, in which case the receiver isn't creating the noise, and then we're happy. So, a little break here. We're 2/3 of the way through. What's your, do I have any questions now?
Okay, thank you, Rob. Well, we've got a question from John 2E0TWQ. He says, have you ever tested the ELAD FDM-Duo 5-watt multi-use SDR transceiver?
I have tested it. It was a few years ago, and I do have a PDF available for that. I tested it actually for a company that just wanted evaluated. I didn't put it on the website. I guess I could. It was sort of mediocre, and it also was reviewed in QST. So you can look at that, and I'd be happy to send the review. The one thing, if you're using a QRP rig on a parks on the air and summits on the air, or just in a park, there's probably no issues because you're not going to have a big antenna. But the dynamic range of the Duo, I think it's 65 dB, so it's not a stellar performer in a pileup. But then for general operating, it may work just fine.
Okay. Well, if you, on behalf of John, I'm sure that he would like to see that. So if you don't mind sending that PDF to me, if you're all right with that, Rob, and then I'll share it with anybody who asks, including John.
Sure, and anybody wants a PDF of anything that I have, just rob@nc0b.com, and that's on the last slide. Okay,
great. Thank you. I've got a question now from Tom G0JSV. He says, I've got a shortcut on my Windows desktop pointing to www.Sherwood Engineering, sherweng.com table, and regularly check to see how the latest kit compares, e.g. the Yaesu FD-DX10 and the ICOM IC705. He says, but there are some omissions in the table. A prime example are the radios from Expert Electronics, e.g. the Sun Pro 2 SDR, etc. I personally own 2 of the radios from the first section of the Sherwood list and several other radios from lower down the list. So a question to Rob, why are radios such as the Expert Electronics Sun Pro 2 SDR missing from the list?
Well, that's kind of an odd one. We had that unfortunate incident with the MB1, and then Adam Farson, who also tests radios, not as many brands as I do, and he does have data on the model you just mentioned, and he ran into several issues with the testing numbers weren't very good. But again, we have to consider what's our environment. So I wouldn't be against testing one, but if you look at Adam's numbers, they're pretty far down the chart. So it just wasn't sort of on my radar. But if someone really wanted to get numbers beyond what Adam has, then I could run it through the lab. There are things that are missing, like the 991A is from Yaesu. I just haven't run into one. I don't have access to every radio, so there's some omissions that there's no particular reason for it.
And I guess I'm just guessing here, Rob, that if the manufacturers must be quite keen for you to test their radios, but I guess if they sent you one direct from the manufacturer, would you be a little suspicious that maybe it was a particularly good one that they've selected, or how does that go?
Well, that's why I'm only doing random samples now, and I don't take anything directly from the manufacturer unless it's through a dealer and I can walk in and pick a random box off the shelf.
Okay.
Kenwood does it the best. Of course, if you don't sell through distribution like Elecraft does not, and Flex does not, in the U.S. anyway, there's no way that I'm going to take one directly from the OEM because it might be tweaked to be, like the 1 out of 100. So I can't let that happen.
So that's your integrity, really. Just saying that I need to have one that's independent.
So for instance, I'm sure I'll see a K4, but it'll be from some ham that's willing to let go of his new toy.
You might be waiting a while, I guess.
I hope not.
Someone said, Paul has actually said that the ELAD PDF is actually on your website under QRP files. So maybe John can get it that way. But if not, you said you'd send it to me. Chris G4CCX says, have you ever tested the Flex 3000 and 5000 radios?
Yes, and they're on the website. They're on the table. And the 3000, it had some issues with the preamp, and there was a recall. And so if you have one, you should get it updated. If you didn't have the preamp updated, and the 5000, of course, goes back quite a ways before the 6000 series. So it's a different type of design, unlike the direct sampling. It's not a direct sampling radio.
I've got one question for you now. This is from me, or maybe I should leave. No, I'll leave that one till the end. I've just thought of a question that I've been wanting to ask you. But one thing, figures can't be argued with. If you've got the right test equipment and it's all calibrated and you do your tests, then nobody can argue with that. But when it comes to ergonomics, surely that's a matter of personal preference. So, and I guess you've explained that anyway. So, for example, you said something about one of the Yaesus, the new Yaesu 10, I think the FTDX10, for example, you said that the waterfall stops and you lose all the history as soon as that happens. That is, though, still a matter of an opinion about how you feel the ergonomics, and whether it's to your preference or not. So my question, I guess, is have you ever come across something where you really didn't like it in terms of ergonomics, but someone speaks up and says, no, actually, I think that's really good?
Oh, it happens, sure. I mean, that is very subjective. Just like people say, well, can I rate the noise blanking or the noise reduction? Well, I may find that in my environment, something works or doesn't, and someone else on an email reflector says, well, I think it's tremendous. So that's all over the map. Certainly ergonomics are a very personal choice. I found with the 10 that aside from issues with the display, and I'm surprised that other people haven't commented on the fact that the waterfall history goes away. A friend of mine in Boulder did a video back and forth with someone who owned the 101D, and Tom was pointing out, well, look what happens when you just transmit one DIT or push the push to talk, all that goes away. He said he'd never even noticed it. So what bothers me may not bother someone else. So I don't know how to deal with that other than it's nice when you can go to a radio store and sit down in front of it, but that's not an option for a lot of us.
No, especially not at these times as well.
No, for sure.
Absolutely.
Now, like the 101D, as far as is exclusive of the screen, much bigger, much more spacing between the buttons. But on the 10, it's a fairly small radio. And so the buttons are all around the tuning knob. And it's also got the same dual tuning knob as the 101. So it's got a slightly smaller knob that's the main knob, and then a bigger knob behind it. And then the volume control is just to the left of the tuning knob. Well, I'm right-handed, so I would tend to reach for the volume control and bump the tuning knob. Or if I went to push a button that's right around the tuning knob, maybe I hit two at once. So that was my issue. So then I started just using a pencil, hit the pencil eraser on the knob. But someone that has small hands maybe wouldn't even notice that. So the ergonomics are absolutely personal choice. And some, like you said, some people will say, well, gee, I think it's great when I don't think it is great. So, that's just what is.
Absolutely. And everybody's entitled to their opinion, but it's good. The facts and the figures, they're the bits that can't really be disputed. Ray G3XLG has said, Transmitter testing, you mentioned pre-distortion being very desirable for SSB, but only from Apache at the moment. What other transmitter testing are you doing at the moment?
Well, a friend of mine who has some slightly newer test equipment, not that I couldn't do it, but he's been doing the transmitter testing for auto distortion and things like that. And while nothing like that is in my web page now, at some point I'll have more data on more rigs and more amplifiers, because we can use the Apache with the pure signal that has very low distortion to test amplifiers now on all bands. Even the Leak can't do that because normally they just do it on 20 meters. So over time, I'm going to have more information on transmit splatter, intermodulation, and on both rigs and rigs and amplifiers. And also I do have information on latency. As you know, the more digital a radio is, it may have a lot more latency. If you're a really fast contest operator on CW, the latency of like 100 milliseconds might be a real problem for you. So I've got data on that, and that's in a PDF. So there's a lot of things that are either exist now. Transmit composite noise, I've got data on about 7 or 8 rigs on that. So I have to come up with a way to make all that available. Probably links on the website eventually that'll just let you download a PDF.
All right, that's really useful. Well, I think we better now let you get back to your talk. Rob, as I've said before to everybody at home now, if you've got any questions at any time, you can ask them throughout this, or there'll be one final session available for questions at the end. But back to you for the moment, Rob.
Okay, so we're going to talk about mostly transmitter side now. This is the cleanest transmitter I've owned. It's kind of out of production, the Collins 32S3. It had 6146s in the final and negative feedback and very clean transmitter. Now, every transmitter, every amplifier has some level of distortion, but this is unusually good. So the way we measure in the lab with a spectrum analyzer, we feed in the 2 tones. They're equal tones. And then you put one cursor on one of the 2 tones and the other cursor on whichever auto order product you want to measure, 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th. In this case, the dot is on the 3rd. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner that it says 36.5 dB. And that's what we call DBC, dB below the carrier. Well, the carrier in this case is one of the 2 tones. But that's not the way the magazines and the advertisements advertise their distortion. They advertise it against PEP, and all they do is add 6 dB to the number. So that would make the Collins, instead of a 36.5, which is super, 42.5. So it's kind of like switching your speedometer between miles per hour to kilometers. Well, you're not going any faster, but the kilometers number reads bigger. So that's what this feel-good method of PEP. So we're stuck with that. That's what they put in most of the reviews, and that's what they put in the advertisement. So we just have to realize that when we make a measurement this way, to make it consistent with the others, we just make the number 6 dB bigger. The thing to look at on this Collins is this spectrum analyzer span is plus or minus 20 kilohertz. And the Collins is down 80 dB plus or minus 10. So that's really good. Here's the next one. This is the second cleanest transmitter I've owned, and this is the TS990S. It has a 50 volt PA, and I would say in general, radios that run on 50 volts for the PA are 5 or 6 dB cleaner than the one that's run on 13.8. Well, in this case, it was only 2.5 dB worse than the Collins, so that was good. It was 34 versus 36.5. But look, it doesn't fall off as quickly. Instead of being down 80 dB, which is way down, at plus or minus 10, it was down plus or minus 18. So it had more wings on it than the Collins did. Well, here's a K3, and it's, well, almost 10 dB worse than the Collins. The span, though, is if we look at, is it down 80 dB before it got to plus or minus 20? No. So the wings are even wider. But the reason really I've got this slide here is to show how did we get away with the upconversion radios that had a close-in dynamic range of about 70 dB. For CW and RTTY, that really wasn't adequate, but why did it work on sideband? Well, let's say we're 4 kcs away from this guy who's calling CQ contest. Well, maybe his sidebands are down more than 45 dB because that comes from the sibilant sound, the high frequency sound in your voice is what really splatters out. So let's say it's down 50 or 55 dB. Well, the radio over here at TS590SG, the dynamic range at 2 kilohertz is 92 dB. Well, if the splatter's down 50 or 60 even, the radio's dynamic range is not the limit. So that's why we were able to get away with radios that were really less than ideal for as long as we did. But luckily, that's history. We don't have to buy 70 dB radios anymore. Now in CW, the key clicks, as you saw in that one screenshot, can be really bad, and there's no point in it. But the problem is, all the modern radios, you can go into a menu and select your rise time, but they let you pick an inappropriate rise time. You should never be picking 1 millisecond or 2 milliseconds. So here's an example of the key clicks of a TS890S. And you would hope that you could, you could hope that you could work a signal 1 kc away from a strong one. That the guy that weak is a kc away from the strong guy. Well, the key click difference here is 25 dB. 25 dB more key clicks with a 1 millisecond selection in the menu as opposed to 6. I don't think the OEM should even let you pick that. Now, Elecraft will not let you pick it. They won't let you adjust it at all. I think they pick something like 5 or 6, and it's, built into the radio. So you can't have terrible key clicks unless your radio was broken or something. So when you should go into your menu and pick, I would say, either the highest number, the 6 millisecond, or some of them go to 8. Some go from 1 to 6, some from 2 to 8. And the other problem is you may not even get what you're picking. With the 101 or the 10, if you picked 6 milliseconds, the rise time was 2.8. So, and if you picked 1, it was like 0.5. So your key clicks can really be a problem with the 101, even if you're trying to be clean. So go into your radio and adjust the rise time. Transmit composite noise, we don't hear much about it, but let me give you a real world example after we just look at 3 different radios. The K3S is really the top notch, and it's a really big number, minus 141. Don't worry about what the number means, but it's a great number. At 100 kilohertz, it isn't much different because it's so good to start with. The ICOM 7610, well, it's not as good at 10 kilohertz offset, but it's almost identical at 100, so that helps. Then we've got the AZU 3000. It's not good at 10, and it doesn't get any better. So here's a case where a station could be 100 kilohertz away, and you might be hearing his noise. In a recent 10-meter contest, I not only found a station that had key clicks 35 kilohertz wide, and I found him by tuning in his key clicks, and there was another station that had horrendous composite noise. And so I finally found him, and not only did he had transmit composite noise that was like 50 kilohertz wide, he had 10 extra copies of his CW signal near the signal. So he had all these extra spurious, so that was just awful. So to give you an example of what can happen, in Boulder, Colorado, it's sort of in a bowl, but one ham lives up on the foothills, and he's 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet above the city. So he's line of sight to the city of Boulder. He used to have an FT 1000 MP, and a lot of people had a 1000 MP. It was a very popular radio. And he didn't bother anybody on 15 meters, particularly another station in the city that has stacks on 15. But then he switched rigs and bought an FTDX 3000. Suddenly, on 15 meters, his transmitted noise was about 200 kilohertz wide over S9 with noise. So we even, I even had my associate go up and make measurements on his transmitter. That's where the Yaesu numbers come from. So that's a shame. We shouldn't be seeing that. Luckily, most are not that bad. But this is the first time with the new Yaesu 101 and the 10 that they've got a handle on transmit noise. So I don't know how many people do read QST on your side of the pond, but there was an article in November 2019 that I wrote, and the league titled it, "It's Time to Clean Up Our Transmitters." If you want a PDF copy of it, I'll send it to you. So 3 cheers for the league, because I was pointing fingers at the OEMs that we've got key click troubles that you at least can improve, if not make them good. We've some cases, many transmitters have transmit noise, particularly the Yaesu, except for the new ones. And we have splatter that we all have some level of splatter, but only one brand right now offers that pre-distortion. Flex has talked about it for years. They say it's something they can do. And Elecraft says they will do it. When we'll see it, I don't know. It was also interesting in the same issue. They tested the Expert 1.5 KFA, and it had distortion down minus 30 PEP. That'd be minus 24 the way we measure it, but we're stuck with the PEP method. But then they turned on pure signal using an Apache exciter, and the amplifier's distortion went from minus 30 to minus 47, 17 dB better. Just like you saw in that one slide that showed my signal, which wasn't super clean to the Apache. So it's a big deal. Solid state linear amplifiers are not so linear. The league published a compendium of tube type amplifiers back in 1997. That's probably all we had with tube type. And every one of them was, this PEP number was minus 40 to minus 50. Well, what do we have today? Everybody has LD MOS amplifiers, and you don't have to tune them, and they follow your transceiver around. But the Elecraft minus 30, that's 10 or 20 dB worse than the tube amps. Not sweep tube amplifiers, but good tube amps. The Flex that we tested, minus 30. The SPE in the same issue of my article, minus 30. Well, my TS990 is minus 40. So if I run my 990 through my alpha tube amp, it doesn't get any worse. If I ran it through a typical LD MOS amplifier, it's 10 dB worse. The league has just started publishing input-output curves, and I hope they keep doing this. Here on the left is the Elecraft amp, and you would, in a perfect world, that would be a straight line. Well, it's not bad. So that's the blue line for the Elecraft, and you see it's beginning to tip down as we go above a kilowatt. But then the real problem was the ACOM 1200S. Now, in this case, it's the red ones, the 20 meter one, and it's real straight up to about 700 watts. But then it flattens off terribly. If I was going to run that amplifier on sideband, I'd run it at half power. If I was going to do CW or FT8 or RIDIC, no problem. But I would not run that amplifier at rated power because that would be a splatter special. The league did test it at full power and half power. So we got to see that. Really look at fifth order, because sometimes the third order numbers are confusing. Because in this case, the ACOM was virtually identical third and fifth. Whenever you see that, that's a red flag that it's not very linear. But look at the fifth order. You can see that once we started running the ACOM at half power, it was really good in comparison to all the other amps. So you just have to pay attention to the details. It isn't always obvious. So bottom line, whichever brand you either have or you want to have, you can get a good radio today that's in the top as far as receiver performance, in that top tier. The limit today might be noise, and I'm using noise generically: splatter noise, key click noise, transmit broadband composite noise. In that case, you can't do anything about it. It's not your receiver. Ergonomics and price may be how we pick a radio today of those top tiers, because the numbers are just completely fine for a large number of choices, and we're not stuck with 2 or 3 radios. So there we have it. There is my email address if you want a PDF of anything. If you just want some rig that maybe I've tested, I've probably got a PDF on it in more detail. So rob@nc0b.com, rob@nc0b.com. And there we have it.
Okay, Rob, thank you very much. We're going to just, I think you stopped sharing your screen there. That's why we got that funny image, but don't worry about that. Okay, well, I've just put a little note a few minutes ago. If anybody has got any other questions for you on the watching either on Facebook or on BATC, this is the time to get those questions in right now. Otherwise, we'll be saying farewell to Rob because he's been on here for nearly 2 hours now. That's quite a long time to be here. I think one of our members has had a struggle to get onto your website at the moment, but we did go on there ourselves, so I don't think there's a problem with your site at the moment. One of the question I was going to ask you, and is if you're not afraid to say this, because I know people trust you and everything, but what is your favourite rig? If I say set a budget of say $3,000 maximum of all the radios that you've got, it's probably the one I guess that you've got, but what would be your favourite rig if you were going to go out today and buy a rig?
Well, I'll tell you what I own, and certainly $3,000 in that list. The 7610 is $3,000, and I own 2 of them. I also own 2 of the 7300s, and I've run one or the other in 8 contests. So I don't really have to spend $3,000. It sort of depends what I'm doing. If I'm looking at CW contesting, I want an audio peak filter, and I want silent TR switching, because the 7610 has silent, like pin diode switching, where, for instance, the 7300 has relays. And one of my amps, my most favorite amp, is the Alpha 89, and it's got pin diode switching. So if I'm running a rig with solid state TR switching and that amplifier, it's quiet. There isn't a sound except a little air blowing through the rig. So I own ICOMs, and have owned the 990. I've owned the 890S. So that's what I own. But that doesn't mean that just because that's what I've picked, that says something negative to the other brands. I'm an older guy. I'm 73 years old. I'll be 74 in April. I'm a knob guy. I like knobs. I like sitting in front of the radio. I do use a computer, of course. I mean, logging. Or if I'm running FT8 or on 630 meters, I'm running that new FST4, or before that JT9, and sure, I'm running a computer then. So, but my computer does logging for my normal operation, and those are the rigs I pick. I've certainly run the Apache, I've run the Flex, and one of these days I'll run a K4.
I guess one of the wonderful things about buying a radio nowadays, at least most of them, is that because they are so much based on software, whether they're an STR or sort of a hybrid, is that you can change so much of it. The manufacturers could change so much. I mean, the Flex is the best example, I guess, because in its basic form anyway, it doesn't come with a front panel. But I mean, in theory, all of the other radios, I guess, the hardware inside, the architecture would allow them to change quite a lot of features. So it does allow them to improve and maybe change as styles and things go on. I mean, that's something that's different to, say, rigs from 20 years ago.
Let's talk about 2 things there. I mean, first of all, I think, this is a guess, that once the 7300 came out, and they've sold 45,000 of them, it was obvious that people like knobs. And then soon after that, Flex came out with the M series Flexes and also the Maestro. So you can buy a Flex with knobs. And then if you run an Apache, there's something called DJ console, disc jockey console, and you've got knobs and buttons, and you can program those to work. So you can run the, we'll call it the computer radios with knobs today. So that's just a personal thing. And there was something else I wanted to mention.
I was just really commenting that the actual ergonomics and the way they're used could be changed quite a lot using software nowadays.
Right. So I don't like the term SDR anymore, because software-defined radios, every radio in my shack is so much software. So I like to talk about direct sampling or superhead or hybrid. But for instance, the older ICOM 7700 and the 7800, it didn't come with a waterfall. it's got a waterfall today. So those type of features. Now the physics part is fixed, but then like in the case of the Elecraft, it was a modular radio, and you could unplug a module and put a new one in, like the synthesizer. So that's not common from Japan, but the Elecraft was a modular radio, and the K4 is a modular radio. So you can add that HD module. So, but whenever a K4 goes through my lab, it's probably not going to be feature complete, but that's probably the physics part of it. It's going to have an ADC driver chip, because an ADC is noisy. So it's got to have a gain chip, like 20 dB gain chip, exclusive of maybe a preamp. And that's pretty much fixed in stone, and they're all pretty much the same. But then when the super het module comes along, that'll be really interesting to test that. So we've got a lot of flexibility, and we really need to pay attention to the brands that are fixing bugs and proactively adding features. Now, for instance, Warren Pratt, NR0V, that does all this programming for the Apache's DSP stuff and pure signal, etc. He just lives 50 miles from me, or even closer than that. He can add a feature in like 3 days. And he just added true RMS measuring of the signal, because we wanted to make some band noise measurements, and it had averaging and peak reading. And he says, okay, I'll write a true RMS measurement, and you can pick that now. So really the software can be updated amazingly quickly, depending on how proactive the OEM is, or in the open source. I mean, that's the one thing about open source. All sorts of people can write to the radio and make it better.
Yeah, that's really good, isn't it? We've got a few more questions for you now. Jim G3YLA asks, frequency doesn't seem to get much mention these days. Does he assumes that they are all good enough?
Frequency? I didn't understand the question.
No, I'm not absolutely sure. It's what I've just read verbatim what he said. Frequency doesn't seem to get much mention these days. Assume they're all good enough. Maybe it's frequency stability as a guess. Jim, if you'd like to add a comment to that, I'll read that to Rob in a moment.
Okay, well, probably for HF, it's not much of an issue unless you're doing like the frequency measuring contest that the league runs every year. But it is an issue at VHF. And for instance, the new 9700, which I do own, replaced a 30-year-old ICOM 2-meter rig, they goofed it up. They can put a 10 megahertz reference in, which should give you absolute rock stability, like from a GPS discipline oscillator, or an oven oscillator, or a rubidium oscillator, all of which I have, but it doesn't work right. But the funny thing is, there are 5 other ICOM radios that it actually phase locks to the external source. Flex offers an internal GPS DO, and I assume you can feed in your own. And the Kenwoods offer that feature. So if you really do want absolute accuracy besides stability, and the Elecraft is going to have that. So if that's what you need, it's available on a lot of brands. So
maybe the 9700 may be something they can tweak with software as a future update or something.
You would hope. One person said on the groups.io reflector, he said it would be possible in the FPGA to fix it, because you could, if you did clever programming, you could fix that instead of what ICOM did. So whether they'll fix it, I don't know. But he said it can be done. You've
been doing this a long time, Rob, and I'm not as clever and nowhere near as clever an experienced an engineer as you, but I did have a background of engineering. I worked for the Philips Group in my early days. And in those days, you could take a schematic diagram and you could break it down, and you could see pretty much how it was going to work. It wouldn't tell you what the performance necessarily was of all the components, but you could see the functionality and the architecture. Nowadays, with so much of it in software, it must be very difficult for you to actually work out, what the real architecture internally is in for things like the FPGA, as you mentioned, which, just for those people watching who are not into the electronic side, is a field programmable logic array, which basically is a chip which can be configured from the outside using software. So how do you get your head around what the architecture actually is in a radio?
Well, the broad strokes we know. And what's unfortunate is not every company gives you a schematic, and I find that a problem. So, but I don't really care what's in the radio. It's a box. We hook an antenna up to it, we hook a speaker up to it, and a microphone or earphones, of course. So what's going on in the box really doesn't matter to me from the standpoint of an operator. Now, the fact that we can now get firmware updates and make the FPGA do something new or improve the DSP code, that's really important. But again, how it happens doesn't matter. Now, if you want to go to see an interesting demonstration of what is possible in software for noise mitigation, and now most of us live in the city. I was talking gave a presentation yesterday to a ham club in Mesa, Arizona, and several of the people said we gather up our equipment and go out in the desert because it's quiet. So it's too bad it's not quiet at their house. So if you go to NC0B.com/NR0V, NC0B.com/NR0V. That is Warren Pratt's call sign. There's 2 audio clips up there that he presented at Dayton about 3 years ago at the Tapper Forum, and you just cannot believe the amount of noise mitigation that he accomplished with his software. I mean, it's just off the chart. So it would be nice if there was more and more clever programming. I mean, certainly we like fixing bugs, but I think noise is maybe the biggest bugaboo for the average ham today in an urban environment. And if you could get everybody on board to get this type of noise mitigation, that'd be phenomenal.
It would be nice, wouldn't it? It's a shame that I suppose that the manufacturers some of them used to be very open source and open architecture. I'm thinking of Flex in particular, who we've had a talk from, who they used to encourage people to write their own software. It's now the newer generations of radios are much more closed, aren't they? So they're not going to maybe encourage quite as much innovation from amateurs?
Well, it is totally closed, and they don't even supply a schematic. So that's an interesting way to make a choice, but that's the choice because they spend a lot of money on their open source software, and then they changed their minds. So that's what happened. But then, of course, you can't get into ICOM and fix that. You can't get into Yaesu and fix that. So it is really only the open source is that really the Apache and maybe a few others that sort of small, lower, the smaller players.
Yeah, I've got Jim, by the way, came back on that question where I asked about frequency. He was asking about frequency stability for transverters specifically.
Well, the transverter.
That was the last question. Sorry,
right. Well, the transverter is going to have a clock, and your radio's got a clock of some sort, a frequency reference. So, if the rig can be fed in a 10 megahertz reference, that's the solution from the rig side. I don't know if I've ever seen a transverter. I haven't paid attention to that because I don't own one. Whether the transverter has a 10 megahertz reference or not. Certainly on 23 centimeters, this might be a big deal for EME or a Tropo or whatever. So, see, of the radios I have owned or have used, the Flex can take an input, the ICOM and the Kenwood, and the K3, K4 sort of. It doesn't actually phase lock, but it helps. But I don't know the answer to the question, do the transverters have a 10 megahertz input? And obviously the owner would know that. One thing you can do, I happen to own a rubidium oscillator. I have a GPSDO, Thunderbolt. But on eBay, I bought a 10 megahertz Wenzel of an oscillator, and I put it in a case for a piece of test equipment because I wanted a power supply and all that. And so you don't have to be totally exotic to have stability because a Wenzel oscillator, once it's warmed up for 20 minutes, is going to be really stable. So you can do that for like $50.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got some more questions for you now. I've got Sunny M0SYW asks, do you ever use the larger display on the 7300 for contesting? Assuming that you use N1mm, he says. He personally doesn't get along with it.
I've never used a bigger display. I've never found a problem, even with my glasses or bifocus and all that, that I needed a bigger display as far as seeing what I need. But the way I operate with a narrow span, so maybe if you like looking at 100 kilohertz or maybe 70 kilohertz, and instead of zooming in like the pictures you saw, the way I happen to operate, you used a little cursor that runs around, then maybe the big screen makes a difference. I don't know. But I've never felt the need for it. I never felt I ever missed a contact, probably because I used that 5 or 10 kilohertz span in general in a CW contest. Now, we had a 10 meter 1010 QSO party contest a couple weekends ago. Friday was busy. Sunday was busy. Saturday was a disaster. I set the span so I could see 200 kilohertz from 28.35 to 200 kilohertz above that. So in that case, it was just watching the waterfall to see when would a waterfall little straight line pop up and I could go look at it. So I haven't found the need for it, but some people just love them. And I've seen hams that have 2 and 3 and 4 big screens up there. So personal preference.
Yes, and also the 7300 is at the lower end of the price spectrum, isn't it? It's sort of over here, as you said, it is £1,300.
Yeah, it's $1,000 US, right?
Yeah.
And so it is the lowest priced that I'm aware of new radio, and I don't see how a new ham can go wrong.
No, I mean, I'm not an expert on these things, but I've seen that new FDDX10 has just been released. It's released at slightly higher price than the ICOM 7300 over here, but clearly I would have thought that was Yaesu's marketing effort, was to try and hit the 7300 off the spot. From the things you've said so far, it doesn't sound like you think they've done it.
Well, the radio's basic operation is good, but the other problems are what at least were a problem for me. Now, it's in the U.S. it's 1,700, so I assume it's about 2,000 pounds in the UK.
I think it's about 1,500. I think the last time I looked, anyway, when it came out.
Huh.
So it's within a few £100 of the 7,300. So I guess they're aiming at the same market.
I guess so. Well, in the U.S. it's a $700 difference today.
Oh, well, that's big.
So whatever. Well, I ran it in that major CW contest. I had no trouble working stations. The APF worked. I ran 150 hertz bandwidth most of the entire time. It was the display that drove me crazy. But the other problem was that it makes key clicks, and so does the 101D makes key clicks, because even if you set it at 6, it's really under 3. So that needs to be fixed, and Yaesu can fix that.
Well, let's hope they do, and let's hope they're listening. I'm sure they will. Ray G3XLG asks, many modern SDRs have both receiver equalization and transmitter equalization settings facility. Do you set these up when testing radios for receive or transmit, as presumably it would affect your measurements?
I don't for testing, but I absolutely use EQ on transmit on sideband, and on receive on CW. If the radio has not only may or may not have an audio peak filter, but it may have receive EQ. So you're right. I would go in and turn off EQ on receive because it would affect the bandwidth. So if I'm making a measurement in a 500 hertz bandwidth, but it's got some sort of contouring, I don't want that in there because that's not a level playing field. But for instance, the 7300 has no audio peak filter, but it does have receive EQ mode specific. So I go in there and set the high pass filter to 400 hertz and the low pass filter to 700 hertz. So that's kind of like an audio peak filter. It's going to get rid of any kind of noise outside that 300 hertz bandwidth. So make use of EQ, but when I'm testing, that's out of the circuit.
Okay, fine. Well, we're nearly at the end of the questions now. Roger G3LDI, who I know owns a Flex, he says, if only Flex was open source. We've been waiting years for an update, he says. And Chris G4CCX replies to that and says, glad that the old Flex is open source because you get weekly updates from KE9NS.
Right. And Flex is really busy right now with the military contract, and they've really got it. Plus, they moved production in-house of all the radios because they're contract manufacturer went out of business. So they have a lot of things to deal with right now. So we'll hope that the bugs and the features will be improved over time. But you're right, there's some people have been waiting for updates for a long time.
Yeah.
But right now it looks like the 101D folks have been waiting for bug fixes for a long time. So this is important stuff.
Well, it sounds to me like, as someone who doesn't get on the radio as much as I should or would like, but it does sound to me like there's no perfect radio, and yet the ability to change a lot of them with software, as at least it gives everybody a fighting chance. And it's thanks to you in particular, I think, for providing all of these facts and figures for all of these radios and compare them with some of the older radios, and particularly your things you were saying about tube linears. You know, it's very interesting that we haven't moved on maybe quite so far there, but it's thanks to you for publishing all these results. It's clear that you do this out of passion, and it's really helping the amateur community and also probably helping the manufacturers keep up their game as well. So we'd like to thank you very much indeed for coming on tonight, Rob. It's been really good to meet you. And thank you from everybody here at Norfolk Amateur Radio Club. To Rob NC0B, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, and have a good day.
Thank you, Rob. There we go. That's Rob Sherwood from Sherwood Engineering. By the way, we do believe that the website is down at the moment, Rob, if you can still hear me. So your website possibly may be down because several people have said it is now. So hopefully that will be fixed very soon, and we'll publish the details in our newsletter as well. Anyway, but that's about it for tonight from NARC Live. Don't forget tomorrow. Tammy, can we go back to that NASA page now and just quickly have a look at that countdown timer?
Yep.
This is live. Here we go. It's now less than a day. It's 23 hours, 22 minutes and 33 seconds before that Mars lander tomorrow night. So if you're around at 5 to 9 or a little bit before, you can watch the run up to that. It looks very exciting. And of course on Monday we've got the NARC Net on GB3MB at 7:30, and we've got the CW Net at 8:30 on 80 meters. And Wednesday, next Wednesday, the 17th of February, we're going to meet Ian Shepherd, G4 EVK, find out what it's like to be the chairman of the board of the RSGB through a pandemic year, and also his work with the Lincoln Shortwave Club and the Hamfest and all the other things as well that he's been doing in his life. And plus, of course, all the regular stories and your input and your stories and your pictures and everything. We'd love to share them with us as well. Been a great night.
It has.
And so from Tammy M0TC.
Goodbye.
And from me, David G7URP. Thanks for joining us. Do take care. And we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.